Okay, now we get to our second reading, which comes from the letter of St. James. We've been hearing from James now the last 4 Sundays, and now this will be our fifth one, our final one. And it's like we're saving the fieriest one, most fiery, whatever, the most fiery, the most zealous one for last. So anyway, so James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, weep and wail over your impending miseries. Your wealth has rotted away, your clothes have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and that corrosion will be a testimony against you. It will devour your flesh like a fire. You have stored up treasure for the last days. Behold, the wages you withheld from the workers who harvested your fields are crying aloud, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on earth in luxury and pleasure. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous one. He offers you no resistance. Okay, here we go. So remember, so we could talk about this the whole week. So looking at the entire series, the entire letter that we've been looking at, of course, we skipped most of chapter 4, although in this Bible study, I talked about a bunch of the rest of chapter 4 in our session last week. Nonetheless, we skipped over, but over the course of the entire letter of St. James, there's this big theme which came already in chapter 1, which is to be doers of the word and not hearers only. In other words, like what James is getting at, what he has been getting at, what he gets at throughout his entire letter is this reality of the word of God needs to actually change us. We need to be changed by it. It's not enough to just hear the word of God and think to ourselves like, oh, that's really nice. But to actually let it be something that moves us into greater love of God, into a greater awareness of the temptations of sin in the world, right? To keep ourselves unstained, but then also to a greater love of our neighbor. It's not enough to only love God. It's not enough to only keep myself from the world. It's not enough to only love my neighbor. I need to do all three of those things so that I can actually like prove that the word of God, the gospel, ultimately what God has done in the person of Jesus has changed my life. So now James, right before this, he finishes chapter 4, which for him there are no chapters. But he talks about those who are just simply presuming that life is going to keep going on and they're just going to keep on doing these things. And he kind of confronts them. He's like, no, here's the deal. Like, you got to understand, it is only by God's will. It is only if God wills it that you will even have a tomorrow, that there will be a tomorrow. So earlier, as I mentioned last week, he talks about this difficulty of a friendship with the world means becoming an enemy of God. So if I become a friend of the world, I become an enemy of God. And then from there, if I go on presuming that I'm just going to keep on living because that's just what people do, maybe there's a reality there, but more than anything, there needs to be a foundational understanding that I might go on living if God wills it. If he allows me to go on living, and every moment that I continue living and every day that I wake up and continue living, I need to understand that it's only because God wills it to be so. And so I need to actually thank him. I need to seek to glorify him. So now he's writing to the rich. He says, come now, you rich, weep and wail over your impending miseries. So this isn't necessarily connected with that whole like going on living, but I think it might be, this friendship with the world means being an enemy of God. And so if people are still not yet convinced about this, if they're still stuck in trying to live lives of comfort and wealth, he says, okay, well, come on, weep and wail over your impending miseries. It is so strong. Your wealth has rotted away, your clothes have become moth-eaten, your gold and silver have corroded, and that corrosion will be a testimony against you. So like what James is getting at here is that all earthly things we see here, they're merely temporary, that they will not last forever, but it is only the word of God which will last forever. It is only the word of God changing our souls which will bear testimony for us and not against us. And so if we're relying on our wealth, if we're relying on our fine clothing and our gold and precious metals, our silver, well, all of those things are going to wear away with time. But the word of God does not wear away with time, but instead it increases, it perseveres, it persists through time. The word of God endures forever. And so too, whatever we cling to is going to have that effect on us. If we're clinging to our stuff, to our possessions, well, that's going to wear our souls away over time. But if we're clinging to the word of God, well, that's actually going to allow us to persist, to persevere through time in fidelity to God. So he says this, you have stored up treasure for the last days. Behold, The wages you withheld from the workers who harvested your fields are crying aloud, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. So this is actually a teaching of the church, and I should have looked this up in our catechism, but this is actually, we would consider this a grave sin to intentionally withhold wages from workers. For those who are wealthy, to intentionally withhold money from those who have real need of money. This is a grave sin that cries out for vengeance, it says here. This is the foundation for that, is what that the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. And we see this in the Old Testament too, that there's a particular, hatred isn't the right word, but there's a particular rejection that God has in store for those who are unjust toward the poor. So I remember we talked in our last session about how there are parts of the gospel that do call us to love the poor. That particular passage maybe was not one of them, but this one does. This one is very clear that we have an obligation. If we employ people, if we have more than people, we have a particular obligation, especially if people work for us, a particular obligation to be just toward them, to provide a just and living wage, and to pay it expediently, to pay it in an appropriate amount of time, to not withhold it, because withholding it causes them greater hardships, and their hardships cry out to God and reach the ears of the Lord of hosts. So then he says, okay, you have lived on earth in luxury and pleasure. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. You have condemned. You have murdered the righteous one. He offers you no resistance. This is testimony against them. We could think of, from the Gospels, there's the scene of Lazarus, the poor Lazarus. So not Lazarus that Jesus raises from the dead. This poor man whose name is Lazarus, who sits at the doorstep or at the gate of this wealthy man who dines sumptuously and dresses in fine clothing. And Lazarus would long to eat the food of this rich man, but the rich man gives him nothing. And the dogs come and lick the sores of Lazarus. And in the end, what happens? Lazarus and the rich man both die, and Lazarus is with Abraham in Abraham's bosom, and the rich man is in a place of torment. He's in such torment that he cries out to Abraham. He says, Father Abraham, send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in the water so that I can be quenched. Somehow this mysterious thing of like, whatever, I'm dying of thirst over here, like give me something. And Abraham says, no, my son, you in your lifetime received what was good, while Lazarus received what was bad. Now he's receiving what is good, while you are going to receive what is bad. So this reality that is at play, if we're seeking to live lives of luxury, of comfort, of pleasure, well, then we're receiving our reward now. Whereas if we can recognize that all of these things have come from God, our money, our stuff, our possessions, our resources, our talents, all of that comes from God, and they're not meant necessarily for us, but they're meant to be shared with those who don't have those things. If we can live in that perspective, right? So this ultimately gets back to the same thing, to be doers of the word, to recognize that everything I have, everything you have is a gift from God and is meant to be shared with those who don't have the same gifts. Just like they maybe have gifts that are meant to be shared with us. But in a particular way, there's a particular call here to care for the poor. For those who actually can't share in reciprocation, they cannot repay the favor. And that's actually okay, because when we give to those who cannot repay the favor, we can actually trust that the Lord himself will repay the favor in the end. I forget where it's at in the Bible, but I think it's the book of Proverbs. I don't know if that's right, but the book of Proverbs or wisdom, or somewhere in the wisdom literature, it actually talks about that he who is generous to the poor gives alone, lends to the Lord. He who is generous to the poor gives lends to the Lord. Goofed that up. Okay, anyway, so anyway, like that's a real thing, that when I'm generous, that it's actually like I'm making a loan to God. And when is God going to repay that loan? Well, he might repay it now so that I can continue to be generous to the poor. He might also just have me wait so that when I die and I stand before him, I can say, Lord, I was generous towards you, and now I'm asking for your mercy. And he can say, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. When we actually live this way, when we let the Word of God actually change us and transform us so that we love God better, that we keep ourselves pure from the stains of the world and friendship from the world, when we grow in love for neighbor and care for the poor, when we allow the Word of God to change us to not just being hearers of the Word, but to be doers of the Word, then we're living in this pure religion that God has sanctioned, that James talks about in James chapter 1, verse 27. Oh man, that's so good. I love this 5-week series we've had on James. I love the letter of James. It's really practical. I know it's also really strong, so maybe not everyone likes the strength behind it, the boldness behind it, but at the same time, I think it's worthwhile for us to talk about. Okay, there we go. So that's the 26th Sunday in Ordinary Time. I hope this was helpful for you. And Yeah, I don't know. I'll pray. I'll pray for you. Pray that you and I together can have a deep encounter with the Lord at Mass, that our worship can be upright and pure before Him, righteous in His eyes, so that we can offer worship that is pleasing to Him. And in return, He might pour out His grace upon us in a fresh way. What a beautiful gift. Okay, I'll look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.